Good afternoon, class, and welcome to the lecture covering basic learning concepts and classical conditioning. Um, if you're open up to your slides, you will notice that at the bottom of the slides, as usual, there are links to certain videos as well as added information. So you'll notice that there's a link to a YouTube video at the bottom of the first slide that I'm going to get to right now. There you go. So at the bottom of this slide, that helps set the tone for today's lecture in terms of what we're going to cover, and some of the concepts, some of the ideas. So I definitely suggest, if you have the time, which I think we all do at this point, look at the video first. It's a few minutes, and then take a look at continuing on with the slides, whether it's this audio recording or whether it's watching it on your own. So this is an idea of an experiment or classical conditioning right here on the paper. And we're going to get into this a bit more and exploring each one of these individual terms. So what you notice here is a picture of an onion. There's a picture of two people together passionately kissing. And you'll also see a picture of this heart with lights around it, representing sexual arousal. So very briefly and basically, what classical conditioning believed is that if what we have here with the two passionate people kissing is what's known as the unconditioned stimulus. So something that just occurs, that can occur naturally. And the sexual arousal, what is caused, which is the result, sorry, of the unconditioned stimulus or the passionate kissing, is what's called the unconditioned response. So you can look at that as an automatic response, if you will. Basically, in classical conditioning, what they felt that is if you took an object, right, and you paired it with an unconditioned stimulus. So here we're going to take an onion, or onion breath, as it is referred to, and we're going to associate it with, we're going to pair it with passionate kissing. So every time that passionate kissing occurs, onion breath will be paired with it. Then what happens is that over time, just the onion breath itself can lead to what now becomes a conditioned response, which is sexual arousal, because it was paired so often with passionate kissing. In the classical, so a good example of this is if anybody has a pet or seen animals, let's say a dog on cartoons, TV, movies, you'll often see that let's say, when you bring their dish bowl, they're automatically going to start drooling or salivating, because to them, when you bring their dish bowl, what that means is they're going to get fed. So an example of that, they would say, is you can, because that dish bowl is always associated with them getting fed, now you can remove the food and just show the bowl, and the bowl is still going to cause them to drool or salivate. And that's an example of how that pairing together creates a conditioned response, or classical conditioning. We're going to get into it again. You'll notice at the bottom there's terms such as acquisition. So the neutral stimulus, like here, the onion breath, paired with the unconditioned stimulus, so the passionate kiss. So the acquisition is when now just the onion breath is able to create that response of sexual arousal. Extinction is that over time, when the conditioned stimulus, so in this example, just the onion, is over time, when it's just shown on its own, the conditioned response, so the sexual arousal, that's going to go down until eventually just showing the onion is not going to create that conditioned response of the sexual arousal. Spontaneous recovery is the spontaneous recovery of that association. And then we've seen extinction here as well. So in the added notes, I'll let you guys take a read for that. It's just a couple points for yourself. So let's move along. Okay, so learning in a nutshell. Learning, according to classical conditioning, can be defined as the process leading to relatively permanent behavioral change or potential behavioral change. In other words, as we learn, we alter the way we perceive our environment, the way we interpret incoming stimuli, and consequently, the way we interact with that environment or behave. So yes, I definitely want you to have an understanding of what learning is. This definition right here that you see at the top of your page. The bottom point is to further supplement and support your understanding of what the definition is. Again, as often there is a link to a YouTube video at the bottom of this slide. So it's a TED Talk about how we learn anything. Also to add, much of what we learn is from our experience. And the great thing about learning is that we can teach to others what we learn, and we can always relearn certain things. So, topics to help you build new associations about conditioning. Today, what are we going to cover? How do we learn? Concepts of classical conditioning. Pavlov's famous experiment, which serves as the basis for classical conditioning in terms of explaining it. Then, as we mentioned, the terms underneath that: acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. We've covered about half of those briefly at the start of this lecture, and we'll get into them in more depth. Followed by Pavlov's legacy and applications of classical conditioning. So, how does learning happen other than through language or words? We learn from experience and we learn from association. It's important that you know those two forms of learning. Under experience, 1, when we learn to predict events we already like or don't like by noticing other events or sensations that happen first. Point number 2, when our actions have consequences. And point number 3, when we watch what other people do. Okay. Just give me one quick sec, guys. Okay. So we learn by association. 1, when two stimuli can be considered events or sensations, tend to occur together or in sequence. So learning by association is an example of the first slide that you saw and what I was explaining, and then we'll go back into and learn in detail. Or 2, when actions become associated with pleasant or aversive results. And then finally, the third point, when two pieces of information are linked. So to add to that, basic form of learning, associative learning. We learn by association. Our minds naturally connect events in sequence, classically conditioning a fear response with a stove, for example. So I think the example we've all kind of learned the hard way of being told not to touch the stove by one of our parents, and then eventually our curiosity gets the best of us and we end up touching that. So our minds naturally connect events in sequence, right? Us touching the stove, and then after that, the response or the experience we had after that, which was extreme pain wherever we touched it. And so classically conditioning a fear response with a stove is we now associate that fear response that we had when we touched the stove because it hurt us with the stove as a whole. Okay. So associative and cognitive learning. Classical conditioning. Learning to link two stimuli in a way that helps us anticipate an event to which we have a reaction. Operant conditioning. Changing behavior choices in response to consequences. And then cognitive learning. Acquiring new behaviors and information through observation and information rather than by direct experience. So, classical conditioning is what we're going to be looking at today. Operant conditioning is what we're going to be looking at in the following class. And cognitive learning is something that you will come across and be taught as you continue on through this program. And certain theories are going to be associated largely with cognitive learning, and one included amongst many would be Albert Bandura's theory. Anyways. to continue along, just with the added notes at the bottom. So conditioning is the process of learning associations. There are two types of conditioning. Classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, we learn to associate two stimuli and thus anticipate events. The second is operant conditioning, as we've seen, where we learn to associate a response and its consequence. We repeat for good results and we avoid for the bad ones. Okay, let's move along. So, operant and classical conditioning are different forms of associative learning. So, let's take a look at both of them. Classical conditioning involves respondent behavior, reflexive automatic reactions such as fear or craving. Respondent behavior sounds like the word responding, respondent, reaction to. These reactions to unconditional stimuli become associated with neutral, then conditioned stimuli. So again, if we take an example at the beginning where we saw the onion, right? So we saw the onion, we saw the passionate kissing. The unconditioned stimuli was the passionate kissing in that example. And then, so these reactions to unconditioned stimuli become associated with neutral, then conditioned stimulus. So the neutral and then conditioned stimulus was the onion breath. Operant conditioning involves operant behavior, chosen behaviors which operate on the environment. These behaviors become associated with consequences which punish, decrease, or reinforce, increase the operant behavior. And when we look at operant conditioning, we'll look at both positive and negative reinforcement, and we'll look at the concept of punishment. There is a contrast in the process of conditioning. So, if we look at classical conditioning, the experimental or neutral stimulus repeatedly precedes the respondent behavior and eventually triggers that behavior. So the experimental or neutral stimulus in this situation, which was the onion breath, repeatedly precedes, comes before, the respondent behavior, which was the sexual arousal, and eventually triggers that behavior. The onion breath eventually triggers sexual arousal on its own without being paired or without the presence of the passionate kissing. If you look at operant conditioning, the experimental consequence, stimulus, repeatedly follows the operant behavior and eventually punishes or reinforces that behavior. So there, the consequence, right? Let's say like you touch a stove, let's say you talk without raising your hand in class, right? The consequence of that is you get reprimanded by your teacher. Your teacher says, please raise your hand, please don't talk out of turn. So the consequence, which is that I guess being chastised by the teacher, follows the operant behavior, which was speaking out of turn, speaking without raising your hand, and eventually punishes or reinforces that behavior. In this sense, it punishes, right? You spoke out of turn, and the punishment was you being chastised, corrected, or criticized by your teacher. Okay. So, associative learning. Okay, let's just go back for a second here. How it works. After repeated exposure, classical conditioning, after repeated exposure to two stimuli occurring in sequence, we associate those stimuli with each other. The result, our natural response to one stimulus now can be triggered by the new predictive stimulus. Again, example at the beginning of the chapter perfectly explains that. Stimulus 1, you see lightning. Stimulus 2, you hear thunder. So let's just go back as this seems to be moving quickly. Stimulus 1, you see lightning. Stimulus 2, you hear thunder. Okay. Here, our responses to thunder becomes associated with lightning. After repetition, stimulus, see lightning, and the response, cover ears to avoid sound. In associative learning, so with operant conditioning, the child associates his response, or I should say, we'll say his response here because it's an example of a boy. I'm not going to be sexist, but so the child associates his response or behavior with consequences. The child learns to repeat behaviors, saying please as an example, which were followed by desirable results, getting a cookie. The child learns to avoid behaviors, yelling give me, which were followed by undesirable results, scolding or loss of dessert. So you see here, A, response being polite, please. Consequence, getting a treat. C, behavior strengthened of being polite again because it was reinforced by the positive result. So, cognitive learning. Cognitive learning refers to acquiring new behaviors and information mentally, rather than by direct experience. Cognitive learning occurs, 1, by observing events and the behavior of others, and 2, by using language to acquire information about events experienced by others. So this can be an example. So it says here, referring to acquiring new behaviors and information mentally rather than by direct experience. So what you saw before was the direct experience in terms of certain behaviors, physically experiencing that, whereas here it's more cognitive or mental perception of the information. Let's move along. So classical conditioning. Topics to help you build new associations about conditioning. Classical conditioning versus operant conditioning, as we covered just previously before. Pavlov's experiments and concepts, which we see here, acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. Generalization and discrimination as well, which are some of Pavlov's concepts. And then the application of classical conditioning. So let's get into it. Ivan Pavlov's discovery. So we'll read a little picture there, just for your own sense. Okay, so while studying salivation in dogs, Ivan Pavlov found that salivation from eating food was eventually triggered by what should have been neutral stimuli, such as just seeing the food, seeing the dish, seeing the person who brought the food, or just hearing the bell for food. Sorry, just hearing the person's footsteps, not the bell for food. My apologies. It's blocked by the caption. I do apologize for that. You can go in and move it on your own. Or, you know what? Let me see if I can correct that. Okay. So, just to explain, right? So while studying salivation in dogs, Ivan Pavlov found that salivation from eating food was eventually triggered by what should have been done. So, and notice what the neutral stimuli are. Just seeing the food, seeing the dish, seeing the person who brought the food, and just hearing the person's footsteps. What happened is that every time the dogs were going to be fed, all of these things occurred. When they knew that when they were actually fed, what happened before? They were able to see the food being brought. Their dish was brought as well or put out to be able to put the food in. Seeing the same person who regularly brought them their food, right? Because that was always the steps. That person came out. It was always the same person. They had the food with them. They brought the dish with them to pour it in, and they also heard that person's footsteps when they were approaching the feed. So what happens is all of those four things started to create the same unconditioned response that eating would, right? Salivation in dog. All of these things would do that because they were paired with eating the food. So then, as we'll see as we continue along, each one of them were able to create the salivation on their own. So just to add a few points from last slide, we'll go back. So a background on Pavlov. So he was a Russian psychologist who was conducting research aimed at better understanding the digestive patterns in dogs. During the experiment, he became intrigued with the observation that dogs deprived of food began to salivate when one of his assistants walked into the room. Um, he soon shifted his research to focus on this behavioral phenomenon and began establishing the laws of classical conditioning, or as he called it, Pavlovian conditioning. So Pavlov is famous for his bell experiment. He would begin pairing a bell sound with the meat powder, and found that even when the meat powder was not presented, dogs would eventually begin to salivate when just hearing the bell. Classical conditioning starts with a reflex, that is an innate involuntary behavior elicited or caused by an environmental event. So that reflex was the salivation that's caused by an environmental event, which was the presence of food. Take, for example, if air is blown into your eye, you blink. You have no voluntary or conscious control over whether the blinking occurs or not. Okay. So what would happen in that is it was always the same lab assistant who was bringing the food to the dogs in Pavlov's experiment. And then he noticed that even when the assistant didn't have any food with them, just seeing the assistant would cause the dogs to salivate in the exact same way that they would for food, because the dogs made the association of that person with being fed. Okay. So Pavlov's experiment. So see, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, something that naturally occurs in the environment, and then the unconditioned response, the reflex, is salivation. So the the neutral stimulus, which was the tuning fork or that bell, right, on its own didn't create that reflexive response of salivating. But when the bell was, when, as you see here on the bottom slide, the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, is repeatedly presented just after the neutral stimulus. And that's what's important. So what they did is they would create the tone with the tuning fork, or if you want to use the bell there, then they would present, they would present the the neutral stimulus, which was the tuning fork of the bell. After that, they would present the unconditioned stimulus, which was the food. And then the unconditioned response would occur, which is salivation. By repeating that over and over and over, that pattern, as we said before, we learn or put things together sequentially. The dog started to make the association of that sequence. That the tone of the tuning fork, which came first, was always followed in sequence by the food. So now he made that association together, and the conditioned response is he'll now salivate when the conditioned stimuli, the tuning fork or that tone is rung, or that sound is made because of that pairing that occurred. It's extremely important that you understand the aspects of classical conditioning. You understand this experiment in detail, and you understand the terms of what is an unconditioned stimulus, what is an unconditioned response, what is a neutral stimulus, and what is a conditioned response and a conditioned stimulus. Blah. Okay, so let's keep, so you'll notice the added points at the bottom. Sorry, I keep jumping ahead of myself. The added points at the bottom. So back to Pavlov's experiments. Since the meat powder naturally results in salivation, these two variables are called the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. Now, when we pair the bell, which is called a neutral stimulus, with the meat powder, the dog will salivate. After pairing the meat powder with the bell several times, the dog was eventually conditioned to salivate to the bell alone. The result, the bell alone results in salivation. This is called the conditioned response, since it's not naturally occurring. So the conditioned response is when the dog salivates to the conditioned stimulus, or the bell specifically. And of course, there's a YouTube video at the bottom of that slide that allows you to kind of bring it all home together. So, conditioning a fear response. In this simple hand withdrawal reflex, information is carried from skin receptors along a sensory neuron to the spinal cord. shown by the red arrow. From here, it is passed via interneurons to motor neurons that lead to muscles in the hand and arm, the blue arrow. So you see here, here's a flame, skin receptors. You see the red arrow where skin receptor information is carried from skin receptors along a sensory neuron to the spinal cord. So the red arrow all the way up there. And then you'll see the blue arrow neurons that leads to muscles in the hand and arm. And then point number 2, because this reflex involves only the spinal cord, the hand jerks away from the candle flame even before information about the event has reached the brain, causing the experience of pain. So this can also be represented, this is another way of representing like the same thing. The candle could be replaced by the hot stove if you want. A simple spinal reflex pathway is composed of a single sensory neuron and a single motor neuron. These often communicate through an interneuron. Relayed to the central nervous system, it is a headless warm body could do it. So by linking two events together that occur close together, by linking two events together that occur close together, this results in associative learning. Learning associations also feed our habitual behaviors. As we repeat behaviors in a given context, the behaviors become associated with that context. Example, sleeping patterns. So certain behaviors, if you want to take sleeping patterns, you might find that like when you go into your bedroom and you lie down, that environment can elicit certain behaviors, which is sleeping. Let's continue along. So this is just an example here where you can practice for yourself of, can you identify the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response in the following. Your romantic partner always uses the same shampoo. Soon, the smell of that shampoo makes you feel happy. So in each one of these 4 examples, I want you to be able to identify those. The door to your house squeaks loudly when you open it. Soon, your dog begins wagging its tail when the door squeaks. The nurse says, "This won't hurt a bit," just before stabbing you with a needle. The next time you hear "this won't hurt," you cringe in fear. And then finally, you have a meal at a fast food restaurant that causes food poisoning. The next time you see a sign for that restaurant, you feel nauseated. So for all of these, I want you to be able to figure out what are the appropriate terms. If we look at the first one, your romantic partner always uses the same shampoo. Soon the smell of that shampoo makes you feel happy. So if you look at this bottom part of that, so actually, you know what? No, I'm going to leave this for you guys to apply. I think it's a good way for you guys to learn that information. And then what I'll do is, if for whatever reason you're having difficulty, I'll leave it for you to come speak to me. And then what you can do is you can ask me those questions by sending me a Mio message, and that way I'll answer them directly, and I'll give you a chance to learn and to practice. It'll also cut down on some of this lecture time. So let's move forward. So acquisition refers to the initial stage of learning and conditioning. What gets acquired? The association between a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. How can we tell that acquisition has occurred? The unconditioned response now gets triggered by a conditioned stimulus. Example, drooling now gets triggered by a bell. So as you'll see, on the bottom here is a function of time, and this axis here, the y-axis, if I remember correctly with my math, is the strength of the association, right? So the strength of the conditioned response. So as time increases, you'll notice that the strength of the conditioned response is increased and goes up. So acquisition, the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired together, and then over time of that pairing, the conditioned response, which will be elicited now by the neutral stimulus, increases. So continue along. Timing. For the association to be acquired, the neutral stimulus needs to repeatedly appear before the unconditioned stimulus, about a half second before in most cases. The bell must come right before the food. If you look at the added notes in the bottom, timing issue. Why wouldn't it work if we rang the bell after presenting the food? Because our bodies and brains are not set up to work that way. Why not? Conditioning allows us to prepare for benefits or threats. A bell after the food wouldn't predict anything. An exception to the half-second rule is food aversion, which we're going to see in a later slide. In higher order conditioning, a previously conditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, creating a new, often weaker conditioned stimulus. Let's move along. Acquisition. The conditioned stimulus needs to come half a second before the unconditioned stimulus for acquisition to occur. So if we're using the example that we saw at the beginning of this lecture, the unconditioned stimulus was the passionate kissing, right? The onion breath starts off as a neutral stimulus, and then if the acquisition occurs, will become a conditioned stimulus. So what happens is you experience the experience of onion breath a half second before passion kissing occurs, and you still have the unconditioned response of sexual arousal. Over time of this pairing occurred, acquisition happens, and now you can just have the onion breath be the conditioned stimulus, so experiencing smelling onion breath, and now you'll have a conditioned response, which is sexual arousal. Let's move forward. Okay, so let me just adjust this. Okay. Sorry, just on the wrong side. There we go. Apologize for that. So the strength of a conditioned response grows with conditioning. In extinction, what happens, or what extinction refers to, is the diminishing of a conditioned response. If the unconditioned stimulus, so in the example, food, stops appearing with the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, the conditioned response, which is salivation, decreases. I noticed that this chart here kind of blocks it out, but we can even go with the example of the onion. So if you take an example of the onion breath that we're looking at before, if the onion breath stops being paired or stops appearing a half second before the passionate kissing, then the conditioned response, so how often a sexual arousal occurs with just showing or just experiencing the onion breath, is going to decrease until eventually it doesn't occur anymore. Okay, so after a conditioned response, so salivation as an example, has been conditioned and then extinguished. Following a rest period, presenting the tone alone might lead to a spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is a return of the conditioned response despite a lack of further conditioning. And yes, after it has been so in order for spontaneous recovery to occur, it first means that the that the conditioned response has to have been extinguished. So extinguishing has to occur first, and then you can have spontaneous recovery. If the conditioned stimuli, so the tone, is again presented repeatedly without the unconditioned, without the unconditioned response. Here, let me see if I can adjust my slides to make this show better. If not, it'll be adjusted when you guys look at it. So yeah, if the conditioned stimuli, so the tone is again presented repeatedly without the unconditioned stimuli, the conditioned response becomes extinct again. And that's just represented here by this chart. So just to add to that, one implication of spontaneous recovery is that a behavior therapist may think that a phobic reaction has been extinguished by repeatedly presenting the phobic stimulus without anything bad happening. However, after a rest from treatment, the phobic reaction can return. One solution is counter-conditioning in order to build a new association. Okay, so generalization and discrimination. You'll see, please notice the narrow psychological definition. So Ivan Pavlov conditioned dogs to drool when rubbed. They then also drooled when scratched. And then in this situation here, Ivan Pavlov conditioned dogs to drool at bells of a certain pitch. Slightly different pitches do not trigger the drooling. So for generalization, an example would be the tendency to have conditioned responses triggered by related or similar stimuli. More stuff makes you drool. In discrimination, the learned ability to only respond to a specific stimuli, preventing generalization. Less stuff makes you drool. So if this isn't clear to you, in terms of generalization, it's that when normally there's a conditioned stimulus that elicits a conditioned response. So we can use the example of, let's say, onion breath eliciting sexual arousal. According to generalization, another stimulus that is similar to onion breath, so maybe it's garlic breath, can also make you elicit the conditioned response, which is sexual arousal. So you're generalizing the things that elicit the conditioned response. It's not specific. In discrimination, look at it as the opposite. It's actually really, really specific. So here, condition dogs to drool at bells of a certain pitch. So in discrimination, the learned ability to only respond to that specific pitch, and discriminate or not respond to other stimuli that might be similar. So I understand that there's both an overlap in terms of the terms are very similar, but they're also in some way the opposite of one another. Okay, so just in terms of the added notes, there are possible evolutionary values for each of these aspects of conditioning. For generalization, if a leopard roars and then bites you, it might help you to survive if you avoid other large cats who roar, and maybe the ones who growl too. So abused children have been found to generally fear any angry face. So an example of generalization in that case. So you can also apply your associations to related situations. If you get hurt by a Colt 45, watch out for all guns. For discrimination, if hearing your mother's voice comes right before getting fed, it might help you to survive if you recognize and distinguish your mother's voice from another voice among a group. Therapy can help anxious people stop having fears triggered by safe stimuli. You can learn to react only when it's appropriate as well. For example, you fear guns, but not someone pointing a finger at you, and you don't develop an aversion to all food. It also goes into the notion of secondary disgust. So disgust for something that looks or feels similar to something disgusting in its own right. Example, chocolate fudge cupcakes versus dog feces. And then finally, able to recognize differences is adaptive. An example, um, being confronted by a guard dog versus being confronted by a guide dog. Okay. So bear with me, guys. We are almost at the end. So Ivan Pavlov's legacy. Insights about conditioning and conditioning in general. It occurs in all creatures, and it is related to biological drives and responses. Um, More to his legacy was insights about science. Learning can be studied objectively by quantifying actions and isolating elements of behavior. And then finally, insights from specific applications. Substance misuse involves conditioned triggers, and these triggers, certain places or events, can be avoided or associated with new responses. And for this, there are a few links to a few videos. So a Facebook video about breaking bad habits, and a link to a TED Talk video also about breaking bad habits. There are also some extra notes at the bottom. So a different application of classical conditioning might include working with phobias, not just creating them, but eliminating them. Exposure to a conditioned stimulus, such as a store where panic attacks have occurred, without the unconditioned response, the panic attack, can extinguish phobias. However, to prevent spontaneous recovery, counter conditioning must also occur, associating the store with a relaxed state. So, and then added to that is, how does classical conditioning play in our everyday lives? Many of our behaviors today are shaped by the pairing of stimuli. Have you ever noticed that the smell of a cologne or perfume, a certain song, a specific day of the year results in fairly intense emotions? It's not the smell or the song that are the direct cause of the emotion, but rather what the smell or sound has been paired with. Perhaps an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, the death of a loved one, your grandmother's cooking, or a really amazing psychology class. We make the associations um, all the time and often don't realize the power that these connections or pairings have on us. But the reality is, we have been and continue to be classically conditioned from the moment we are born until we die. Classical conditioning is one way that virtually all organisms learn to adapt to their environment. Pavlov showed us that a process such as learning can be studied objectively, no judgments or guesses about what went on in a dog's mind. Okay. So, John B. Watson and classical conditioning, playing with fear. So, in this experiment, a nine-month-old little Albert was not afraid of rats. John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner then clanged a steel bar every time a rat was presented to Albert. Albert acquired a fear of rats and generalized this fear to other soft and furry things. Watson prided himself in his ability to shape people's emotions. He later went into advertising. And you can just kind of think about the ethical implications of that. Okay. Experiment, conditioning with a spray bottle. So we'll leave this for now. This is experiment that or something that can be done in class. Obviously, this is something that we would have done had we had class time, but unfortunately, we don't. So experiment conditioning with a spray bottle is usually you can condition with a spray bottle, so that way the spray bottle in and of itself, the spray bottle could have started off as a neutral stimulus, but then can become a conditioned stimulus based on how you pair it. So what you can do is you can actually think about using the spray bottle, and you'll use the example of, let's say with a dog, right? So you can pair, um, let's say the unconditioned stimuli would be, I don't know, if a dog sees, um, a squirrel, it'll start to run. And then the spray bottle is the neutral stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus would be the squirrel, and the unconditioned response would be the dog. You know what? Let's say barking. So every time the dog saw a squirrel, it barked. That would be the unconditional response. You would take the neutral stimulus with the spray bottle, and um, a half second before a dog saw a squirrel, you would, let's say, spray the dog. Spray the dog a half second before, then it sees a squirrel, and then the unconditioned response of barking occurs. Over time of pairing that together, you should be able to just use the spray from the spray bottle to the dog, right? And that alone will now elicit the conditioned response, which is the dog barking. Again, this is something that we would have covered in class had we had the opportunity to be in class, but obviously we can't with the whole coronavirus situation. So next class will be a new topic. If you have any questions, again, I just invite you to send me a quick message by Mio, and we can either correspond through Mio, or if need be, just I'll invite you to a quick Zoom chat and we can have a discussion face to face. Stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you for your time, class. That is all for today.